When a password replaces a person, credentials, relationships, and the shape of trust, you try to access something important, your account, your records, your work, and the system refuses you because a code didn't arrive or a password wasn't strong enough. You know who you are, and the people who know you could vouch for you in seconds, but the gate does not recognize witnesses, it recognizes credentials. In that small friction is a larger question about the kind of society we are building. What happens when trust is routed through technical proof rather than lived relationship? And across what time horizon do we discover the costs of that shift? Modern systems trust credentials more than relationships because credentials scale, relationships do not. And at scale, governance defaults to what can be verified quickly, even when what is verified is only a narrow slice of the person. This reflection will examine why that design choice keeps recurring, what it optimizes for, and what it quietly trades away. It will not claim that credentials are inherently corrupt or that relationships are inherently pure. Both can be reliable and both can fail. It will not offer a neat remedy or a rallying program. It will instead map incentives, constraints, and failure modes, and hold the question open across short, mid, and long horizons where different harms and different kinds of stability appear. To speak clearly, we need a few plain terms. First, identity. In everyday speech, identity sounds like the story we tell about ourselves, history, belonging, character. In systems, identity usually means something narrower, a stable label that lets a process decide what you may access. In a small community, who you are is partly carried by memory, reputation, and context. In a large system, who you are is often compressed into an identifier and a set of attributes. Second, credential. A credential is a portable token that asserts a claim, that you are authorized, that you completed a requirement, that you belong to a category. A badge, a card, a password, a cryptographic key, a certificate. These differ in form, but share a logic. They are designed to travel without the person who issued them. Credentials are meant to be legible to strangers. Third, authentication. Authentication is the act of checking whether a presented credential matches what the system expects. It answers a narrow question. Is this the same entity that previously registered this credential? Or does this credential satisfy this rule? Authentication is not the same as trustworthiness and not the same as character. It is proof of continuity, not proof of wisdom. Fourth, relationship-based trust. This is trust formed through repeated interaction, shared context, and accountability over time. It is not mere familiarity. It is a governance mechanism embedded in social life. When someone can endorse you, confront you, or withdraw association, trust becomes a living contract. With these terms, the core question becomes more precise. Why do large systems choose authentication over acquaintance, verification over vouching, credentials over relational testimony? A first answer is scale. Relationships require time, attention, and ongoing context. They are high resolution but expensive. Credentials are low resolution but cheap to check. In small groups, high-resolution trust can be maintained because the number of relationships is bounded and the cost of context is manageable. In large systems, the number of interactions grows beyond what any set of people can hold in mind. The system must choose between slowing down to preserve context or speeding up by compressing context. A second answer is liability and legibility. Institutions, any coordinated system with rules and boundaries, prefer decisions that can be explained after the fact. The rule says yes is easier to audit than someone knew them. Credentials are records. Relationships are stories. Records can be stored, compared, and replayed. Stories change with perspective. A third answer is uniformity. Credentials promise consistent treatment. The same input yields the same output. Uniformity can be a form of fairness, but it can also be a way of avoiding judgment. When judgment is costly, uniformity becomes a substitute for care. Now, assumptions. This reflection assumes that modern systems face repeated interactions with strangers and must manage access to resources, roles, and information. It assumes that errors matter. Letting the wrong person in can cause harm, and keeping the right person out can also cause harm. It assumes that adversarial behavior exists. Some actors will attempt to obtain benefits without meeting the conditions. And a model limit. This analysis treats systems as if they choose, but systems are made of people, incentives, budgets, and habits. Often no one chooses the overall outcome. Drift accumulates from many local optimizations. Another limit. We cannot measure trust directly. We measure proxies, fraud rates, response times, user complaints, costs. Then we optimize those. What is most meaningful can be least measurable. Uncertainty is not a flaw in this discussion. It is part of what must be governed. With that grounding, we can see why the credential becomes attractive. It offers a clean interface between strangers, a low-cost check, a record for auditors, and a uniform rule for administrators. The question is what else it becomes when it is asked to carry more weight than it was designed for. The deeper tension is not technology versus humanity. The tension is governance under scale, speed versus safety, capability versus control, and local gain versus global stability. Start with speed versus safety. Credentials are fast. A system can authenticate thousands of requests per second. Relationship-based trust is slow. It requires a human to know a human, to remember, to evaluate context. Speed becomes its own incentive because it reduces cost, increases throughput, and satisfies demands for instant access. Yet speed is not neutral. When speed is rewarded, the system shifts toward decisions that can be made quickly. If quickly requires compressing identity into a credential, then identity is compressed. In the short run, this looks like convenience and efficiency. In the longer run, it can become a governance trap. Once the system is designed around rapid authentication, any reintroduction of relational context appears as friction, inefficiency, or bias. The system learns to treat its own constraints as virtues. Capability versus control. Credentials expand capability. They allow remote access. They allow delegation. They allow automation. A credential can be checked by a machine. A relationship requires a person. This expands reach. More services, more coordination, more transactions without needing a human intermediary. But control becomes harder when capabilities multiply. Every credential is a potential lever, and every lever is a potential point of misuse. The more places a credential works, the more valuable it becomes to steal, replicate, or coerce. So the system responds with tighter authentication, more layers, more surveillance of behavior, more constraints. Notice the loop. Scale increases risk. Risk increases verification. Verification increases centralization. Centralization increases tail risk. Now, local gain versus global stability. Locally, each institution benefits by shifting trust onto credentials. It reduces staffing needs, accelerates onboarding, standardizes processes, and satisfies compliance requirements. Each local optimization looks rational. Yet globally, when everyone does it, we get an ecology where identity is increasingly defined by what can be credentialed. This is a subtle but decisive move. Identity becomes what the system can recognize. Traits that fit into forms become more real than traits that require story and witness. The person becomes a set of claims, and the claims become the person. Here the paradox emerges. Credentials are supposed to be tools for trust, but at scale, they can become replacements for trust. When the credential is present, the system trusts by default. When it is absent, the system distrusts by default, even if relational reality is strong. Consider two failure modes. A local failure mode. False rejection at the boundary. The right person is locked out because a credential is missing, expired, corrupted, or inaccessible. The system treats the credential as the person, so a credential failure becomes an identity failure. In a relational setting, the community can repair this quickly. Someone recognizes you. Exceptions are made with accountability. In a credential setting, exception handling is expensive and often discouraged because exceptions undermine the premise of uniformity. A systemic failure mode. Credential inflation and brittle dependence. As more systems demand stronger proof, credentials multiply and become more complex. Complexity increases the number of failure points, and dependence increases the blast radius when something breaks. The overall ecology becomes brittle. A small error, an incorrect record, a compromised key, a mistaken rule, propagates widely because so many decisions reuse the same credentials and the same verification infrastructure. There is also a moral hazard embedded in incentives. When decision-makers rely on credentials, responsibility shifts. If a credentialed person causes harm, the institution can say, they passed the checks. The credential becomes a shield, not merely a tool, but a way to externalize judgment. Conversely, when a non-credentialed person is excluded unjustly, the institution can say, the rules are the rules. The rule becomes a substitute for moral agency. Over time, incentive-driven drift deepens the pattern. 1. Measurement drift. What is measured becomes what matters. If performance is evaluated by speed, fraud prevention, or auditability, then relational trust, hard to measure, will be minimized. 2. Compliance drift. Rules multiply to satisfy oversight, and each new rule prefers credentials because credentials produce evidence. 3. Product drift. Systems are designed for the average case, and edge cases are treated as noise. But human lives are mostly edge cases from the perspective of a database. 4. Attention drift. Users adapt. They learn to present themselves in ways that the system recognizes. They begin to curate identity for legibility rather than for truth. At this point, it becomes clear that credentials are not merely administrative devices, they are cultural forces. They teach people what counts. Yet we should keep humility. Relationship-based trust also fails. It can become nepotism, gatekeeping, exclusion of outsiders, and protection of insiders. Relationships can be exploited and can hide wrongdoing. The attraction of credentials partly arises because relational trust has failure modes that are painful and visible. So the question is not whether we should return to a world of pure relationship. The question is what forms of governance can hold both truths, that scalable verification is necessary in large systems, and that identity is larger than what verification can capture. Under uncertainty, the discipline is to ask, what does the system permit, constrain, and ignore? Credentials permit speed. They constrain improvisation. They ignore context. Relationships permit nuance. They constrain scale. They ignore uniform auditability. Neither is neutral. Each encodes values. Consequences unfold differently across time horizons. If we collapse time, we misread the trade-offs. So we will look at short, mid, and long horizons, not as predictions, but as lenses. Short horizon, immediate frictions and protections. In the short term, credential-based trust delivers real benefits. It reduces some kinds of opportunistic harm by requiring proof. It allows people to interact safely with strangers at a distance. It enables access outside local networks, which can be liberating. You need not be known by a gatekeeper to participate. A well-designed credential can be a bridge across social boundaries. But short-term frictions are also immediate. The locked-out user, the endless resets, the mismatch between lived identity and recorded identity. When an error occurs, the person must conform to the system's repair process. The system's need for certainty becomes the user's burden of proof. A second-order effect appears even here. People begin to keep their lives credential-ready. They choose simpler names, simpler narratives, simpler paths, not because it is true to them, but because it reduces risk of denial. Identity begins to be managed for authentication. Mid-horizon, institutional habits and shifting accountability. Over the mid-horizon, organizations reshape themselves around what credentials can support. Workflows become credential first. If it cannot be authenticated, it cannot be done. Exception pathways shrink because they are costly and create audit risk. The result is a subtle hardening of the boundary. The system becomes confident, but not necessarily wise. This is where the trade-off between fairness and uniformity becomes sharp. Uniform rules can reduce arbitrary discrimination, yet they can also standardize neglect. When the system cannot see context, it cannot respond to context. This does not produce neutral outcomes. It produces outcomes aligned with the defaults of the data and the assumptions of the designers. Mid-horizon consequences also include the professionalization of trust. Instead of trust being built through repeated local interaction, it is outsourced to credential issuers, identity providers, registries, and verifiers. This can reduce corruption in some contexts, but it also concentrates power over recognition. The ability to name someone valid becomes a critical infrastructure function. Another second-order effect, the growth of an identity perimeter. As more services rely on credentials, the credential becomes a master key to many doors. This amplifies harm from theft, coercion, or error. The system responds by tightening constraints, increasing monitoring, and adding layers. People experience this as an arms race. More verification to defend against more incentive to circumvent verification. Here, uncertainty matters. We cannot know in advance which risks will dominate: fraud, exclusion, centralization, or social fragmentation. But we can say that as dependency increases, tail risk rises. Low probability failures have disproportionate impact because so much is coupled to the same mechanisms. Long horizon, what identity becomes when it must be legible to machines. Over the long horizon, the deeper consequence is cultural. The redefinition of identity as a set of verifiable claims. When credentials become the primary currency of trust, the society's concept of a person can narrow. The person becomes the sum of what can be recorded, scored, and checked. Qualities that resist measurement: loyalty, courage, patience, discretion, mercy, honesty under pressure, become less actionable in institutional decision-making, not because they are unimportant, but because they are hard to credential without distortion. This invites a quiet kind of optimization. People learn to maximize what the system rewards. If access depends on certified traits, then life becomes oriented around earning and displaying those traits. Optimization pursued without reflection erodes meaning. The credential becomes the goal, rather than the capability it was meant to represent. Long horizon consequences also include the transformation of relationships. When a credential can replace a witness, communities are less needed for access. This can be freeing for those trapped by parochial gatekeeping, but it can also thin the social fabric, fewer durable ties, less mutual obligation, more transactional belonging. Trust shifts from "I know you" to "the system recognizes you." And when trust is mediated by systems, the governance question becomes unavoidable. Who sets the rules for recognition? Who audits them? How errors are corrected? And what forms of appeal exist when the credential is wrong? Again, humility. Relationship-based societies can also be unjust, exclusionary, and resistant to change. Credential-based systems can also broaden access and reduce some forms of prejudice. The consequences are not one-directional. But across long time horizons, the central issue is that identity becomes constrained by legibility, and legibility is shaped by incentive and power. If we must name the deepest trade-off, it is this. Credentials can scale trust outward, but they can also compress trust downward, reducing the dimensionality of a person to what fits the verifier. So why do modern systems trust credentials more than relationships? Because credentials are the instrument that scale can afford. Relationships require patience, shared context, and ongoing accountability. Credentials require a check. But afford is not only an economic statement, it is a governance statement. It tells us what the system is willing to pay attention to, and therefore what it will shape. There is a temptation when seeing the limits of credential-based trust to retreat into nostalgia, a world where everyone knew everyone, where a handshake meant something, where the community held identity in its memory. But that world had its own exclusions and its own hidden bargains. There is also a temptation to double down on verification, to believe that if we just refine authentication enough, we can remove the human from trust entirely, because the system still encodes human choices about what counts and what is ignored. Disciplined humility begins with admitting the limits of our models. We cannot fully formalize trust. We cannot perfectly separate legitimate exception from malicious bypass. We cannot eliminate trade-offs between speed and care, or between uniformity and context. Any system that claims to erase these tensions is likely relocating them, often onto the most vulnerable users, or into the least visible corners. What we can do in thought is hold the question at multiple horizons. In the short horizon, we can ask, when a credential fails, does the system have a humane way to recognize a person without collapsing into arbitrary favoritism? If it does not, then we have learned something about the values embedded in its constraints. In the mid-horizon, we can ask, as organizations optimize for auditability, do they lose the capacity for judgment? And if judgment becomes rare, where does responsibility go? Into checklists, into vendors, into policies, into abstractions that cannot be held accountable in the way people can. In the long horizon, we can ask, what kind of person does a credential-first world implicitly train us to be? What happens to communities when recognition is primarily delivered by systems rather than by neighbors? What happens to meaning when the measurable becomes the real? None of these questions yield a clean resolution, because they are not engineering problems alone. They are governance problems. Governance is part of the system. The rules for recognition, the pathways for correction, the tolerance for ambiguity, and the willingness to carry the cost of exceptions without turning them into loopholes. And there is an ethical discomfort that should not be hurried past. Relationship-based trust can be unfair, but credential-based trust can be indifferent. The first can be biased, the second can be cold. The mature task is not to choose a saint and a villain, but to notice the failure modes and the incentives that make them persistent. Under uncertainty, the question becomes, what do we want trust to be for? If trust is only a barrier to keep out threats, credentials will dominate. If trust is also a bond that carries responsibility, then relationships remain essential, even if they cannot scale in the same way. Time reveals failure modes, and it also reveals what we have been willing to neglect. Hold identity across horizons with restraint, because scale multiplies error.